morning Marvin Gaye arrived at Hitsville, USA, he wasn't supposed to sing a single note. He had come as a drummer. That was the arrangement, the thing that had gotten him through the door. A recommendation from Harvey Fuqua, who had watched Marvin keep time in a Washington, D.C. rehearsal room and said quietly that the boy had something. Not necessarily on the kit, just something. Fuqua had brought Marvin to Detroit in 1960, introduced him around, helped him find a room to rent, and made sure the right people at Motown knew his name. But drummer was what Marvin had offered, drummer was what the label had accepted, and on the morning he walked through the door on West Grand Boulevard, that was the only reason anyone in that building had to care about him at all. He sat behind the kit for 2 sessions in January, playing tight, clean patterns that didn't call attention to themselves. The other musicians were professionals, and they treated him as one. Nobody asked where he was from. Nobody asked how old he was. Nobody asked what else he could do. The tape rolled, the tracks were laid, and Marvin went home at the end of each day the same person he had arrived as. He was 20 years old. He was not restless exactly, but he was watching. What he was watching, he couldn't have explained to anyone. He sat behind the drums and observed the vocalists who moved through Hitsville's Studio A, the way they leaned into the microphone, the way they closed their eyes during certain passages, the way the engineer would nod slowly when something worked without saying a word. Marvin stored all of it somewhere behind his eyes. He watched how the air in the room changed when a take was good. He watched how the producer's posture shifted at the board, the way a shoulder dropped or a jaw unclenched. He paid attention to the small, involuntary things, the things that couldn't be faked and couldn't be instructed, because those were the things that told you the truth about what was happening. He wasn't auditioning. He wasn't waiting for an opportunity. He was learning the shape of a room he had never been inside before, memorizing its geometry so that if he was ever asked to move through it, he would know exactly where to put his feet. The scheduled vocalist for the February session was a man named Clarence Paul. Clarence was dependable, experienced, a reliable presence in the Hitsville system, someone who understood what producers wanted and could deliver it without wasted time or argument. His name was on the session sheet. His microphone stand had been adjusted to his height. The engineer had already set his levels based on prior sessions, and when the musicians began warming up that morning, everyone in the room assumed Clarence Paul would walk through the door at any moment, and things would proceed exactly as planned. He didn't walk through the door. An hour passed. The musicians played through the changes loosely, killing time, and the producer, a man named William "Mickey" Stevenson, stood at the control room window and watched the clock with the particular expression of someone calculating how much money was being lost per minute. Session musicians were paid by the hour. The studio was booked. The tracks were ready. All that was missing was a voice, and without a voice, there was nothing to do but wait or stop. Marvin was behind the drums, keeping a loose rhythm on the hi-hat, not trying to take up space. He had been watching Mickey Stevenson for the better part of an hour. He had seen the moment the producer's patience ran out. A slight shift in the jaw, a hand pushed flat against the window glass. And then he had seen Stevenson turn from the window and look at the room with the expression of a man who was about to ask a question he didn't particularly want to ask. "Can anybody sing?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. The musicians looked at each other. Nobody volunteered. Marvin's hands went still on the hi-hat. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't stand up. He just said quietly from behind the kit, "I can." Mickey Stevenson looked at him for a moment. There was nothing in that look that was encouraging. No warmth, no anticipation. It was the look of a man who has run out of better options and is now examining the ones that remain. He gestured toward the vocal booth without saying anything else, and Marvin came out from behind the drums and walked across the studio floor. He didn't know what song they were recording. Someone handed him a lyric sheet and he read through it once, twice. The arrangement was already built. Bass, keys, guitar, drums, horns, and the melody existed in the scaffolding of it, in the shape of the spaces the vocalist was supposed to fill. Marvin stood in front of the microphone and felt the weight of the room shift. Every musician in the studio was watching him now, not with expectation, with the particular attention of people who are about to witness either something useful or something embarrassing. and who have no strong feeling about which it will be. The monitor speakers were broken. He would discover this only after the session, when someone mentioned it in passing, almost as an afterthought. During the take itself, Marvin had no way of hearing himself. No reference point, no feedback, no way of knowing if what was coming out of his mouth was landing anywhere near where it was supposed to be. He was singing into a silence that reflected nothing back at him. All he had was the music in the room, the words on the page, and whatever it was that lived somewhere in his chest and knew, without instruction, how to shape itself into sound. He sang the song from the beginning to the end, without stopping. He didn't know if it was right. He stood in the booth afterward and waited, and the room behind the glass was quiet in a way that told him nothing. Mickey Stevenson was at the board. The engineer had his hand on the reel. For a moment, nobody moved at all. Then Mickey Stevenson rewound the tape. He played it back, and the room heard Marvin's voice come through the monitors for the first time. The musicians who had been watching with polite indifference shifted in their seats. The engineer, a man who had sat through hundreds of first takes in that room, went very still. Mickey Stevenson stood at the board and listened all the way through without touching a single thing. When it ended, nobody said anything for a long time. What happened in that silence is difficult to reconstruct. People who were present in the room that day, interviewed years later, offered different versions of the same few minutes. Some remembered the silence as brief, a matter of seconds before the producer nodded and said they'd do another take. Others remembered it as something longer, 3 minutes or more, a stillness that settled over the room like weather. One musician who was there said only that when the tape stopped, he looked over at the engineer, and the engineer's hands were resting flat on the board, unmoving, as though he had forgotten what his hands were for. Nobody in any of these accounts described what Mickey Stevenson's face looked like during those minutes. That detail, for some reason, is always left out. What is known is that Stevenson didn't speak immediately, and that when he did, he asked Marvin to do it again. Not because the first take was wrong, but because he needed to be certain he had heard what he thought he had heard. Marvin did it again. He stood in that booth and sang the song a second time, and then a third, and by the time they stopped recording, the session had run 2 hours past its scheduled end. The musicians stayed. Nobody asked for overtime. The engineer stopped looking at the clock. Mickey Stevenson, a man known in the Hitsville system for his efficiency and his intolerance of wasted time, stood at the board through every take without once checking his watch. Marvin walked out of the studio that evening the same way he had walked in, quietly without calling attention to himself, his coat collar up against the Detroit cold. He took the bus back to the room he was renting, ate whatever was in the refrigerator, and didn't tell anyone what had happened that afternoon. Not because he was modest exactly, but because he wasn't sure yet what to call it. Something had occurred in that room, something that had changed the temperature of the air around him. But he didn't have language for it yet, and until he did, there was nothing to say. He would not go back to playing drums. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no formal conversation, no clear moment of transition. He simply didn't sit behind the kid anymore, and nobody asked him to, because the tape from that February afternoon had circulated through Hitsville the way that things circulated in a building where everyone was always listening for the next sound, the next voice, the next thing that could be turned into music and music into money and money into something that lasted. People had heard it. The right people had heard it. And what they had heard was enough to change the shape of everything that came after. What they had heard was this: a voice that didn't know how to protect itself. Most singers, even young ones, arrive at the microphone with a set of learned behaviors. Ways of managing the sound, controlling the exposure, presenting the voice as something polished and complete. It is a form of self-defense, and it produces a particular kind of music, competent, professional, and ultimately unreachable. What Marvin did in that booth, because the monitors were broken, and he had no way of hearing himself, and therefore no way of performing for himself, was something different. He sang without armor. The voice that came through was not a performance of a voice. It was the thing itself, unmediated, unguarded, carrying inside it every frequency of the person it belonged to. That was what the engineer's hands had gone still for. That was what had kept the musicians in their seats 2 hours past the end of the session. That was what had made Mickey Stevenson rewind the tape and stand at the board and not say a word. Not skill, though the skill was there. Not technique, though the technique would come. Something underneath those things. Something that couldn't be taught or scheduled or arranged for. Something that had walked into the building that morning behind a drum kit, not expecting to be called upon, not trying to be found. And then, when the moment arrived, had simply been present for it. No one knew, standing in that room, what the voice would eventually carry. They didn't know about the albums that would come, the ones that would pull things out of the air that soul music had never tried to name before. They didn't know about the grief that would attach itself to the voice over the years, the way it would change under the weight of things that couldn't be set down. They didn't know what the voice would cost the person it belonged to, or how long it would take before the person and the voice were no longer the same thing. All of that was still ahead, still unwritten, still waiting in a future that nobody in that studio could see from where they were standing. They only knew what they heard that afternoon. A man standing in a booth with broken monitors, singing into a silence that gave him nothing back, and producing something that stopped time in a small room on West Grand Boulevard. Marvin Gaye was 20 years old. He had come to Detroit to keep time for other people's music. He had walked into a room with a blank lyric sheet and no way to hear himself and sung one song from beginning to end. He would spend the rest of his life trying to find his way back to that particular kind of silence, to that quality of not knowing, not hearing, not measuring himself against anything, just opening his mouth and trusting that whatever came out was enough. Some days he found it. Some days the room gave it back to him, and he felt, for a few minutes or a few hours, like the person who had stood in that booth without armor and let himself be heard entirely. Most days, though, the monitors worked, and he could hear himself perfectly. And that was the problem.